Hey everybody, here to let you know that due to popular demand, Imperial Yeast has decided to extend the availability of their latest seasonal strain, A37 Pog, through September of 2020. The folks I know who have used this stuff absolutely love it. So what is it? A37 Pog is a single Kveik isolate known to produce tons of guava, passion fruit, pineapple, and orange aromas reminiscent of the classic juice blend. Like all Kveik strains, it is highly versatile and can be fermented on the warmer end of the spectrum to produce tropical aromas, or you can ferment it cooler to produce beers with cleaner ester profiles. Grab yourself some A37 Pog before it's too late, and make sure to check out all Imperial Yeast has to offer at imperialyeast.com. Yeast is the living organism that's responsible for turning the wort we make as brewers into delicious beer, and in order for it to do its job optimally, it needs to be taken care of. Now, while many nutrients are naturally present in wort, oxygen, which is arguably the most important nutrient, isn't, which is why brewers commonly dose their wort with pure oxygen from a tank. However, a surprisingly simple and arguably weird alternative was proposed a few years ago that doesn't involve oxygen at all. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me to talk about using olive oil in place of traditional oxygenation is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, I remember whenever we were talking about designing this experiment, and I was proposing using olive oil and actually putting it in beer, and everybody was kind of like, "Oh yeah, I heard that, but that sounds stupid. Why would you put olive oil in beer? That's going to taste gross. You're going to have olive oil flavor in it and all this." And I was like, "Well, whatever. I mean, let's try it. Let's see if it works. There's some science behind it, so let's see if this works."
Exactly. And that's, if we're known for anything, it's testing weird things out that other people don't want to mess around with, right? And so I thought it was interesting. Now, don't get me wrong. I love olive oil, especially when it's paired with diced tomatoes, basil, and balsamic vinegar. And as much as I love drinking beer while eating bruschetta, I never considered putting olive oil in my beer. In addition to talking about valid concerns about doing that, we're also going to be getting into the equally as valid theory about how it might help, as well as discuss the results of an experiment that you performed on this topic, Cade. Very, very interesting one. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive awesome rewards like unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, which this month happens to be $5 off each 1-pound bag of Citra Lupomax hops. A pretty good deal if you ask me, when the monthly pledge is only $5 a month. So there you have it. You'll also receive invites to monthly live Q&A sessions with somebody in the brewing world. Speaking of Lupomax, our guests for September will be Jeff Daly and Alejandro Gonzalez from Haas. You may have heard Jeff on our recent episode where we talked with Haas about Lupomax. He's their associate sensory scientist, and Alejandro is their brewing solutions specialist. As one of the biggest names in the hop industry, this is going to be an excellent session. Be sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by September 24th, 2020 to be a part of this event. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And huge thanks to all of our current patrons. You're the reason that we're here today. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your online shopping. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you're listening to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. It helps people who may not have heard of us yet find the show. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Michael Whitehead from Melbourne, Australia wrote in with an interesting idea. He says, "I trust you know that a well-established method to kill an enemy on a spaceship is to trap them in the ship's airlock. Releasing the external airlock door will result in your enemy being violently sucked into the cold, uncaring vacuum of space. I just listened to your episode about magical SMB pixie dust preventing oxidation, and Jake admitted his method of introducing SMB through the open keg lid is not ideal, as it can introduce a touch of oxygen. oxygen. I have a solution, he says. It requires a carbonation cap modified with the simple attachment of a short dip tube made of beer line. The dip tube should be long enough so that when the carb cap is screwed onto a PET bottle, it should reach the bottom of the bottle. With the carbonation cap in place, purge a sanitized PET bottle at least 3 times with CO2. Now, unscrew the cap and add your solution of SMB to the bottle, then purge the bottle again 3 times to minimize oxygen. With the carb cap still in place and before disconnecting the gas, pressurize the PET bottle to 10 to 20 psi, then connect it to the liquid post on a purged and sanitized keg via a jumper line. As long as there is less pressure in the keg than the PET bottle, any liquid in the bottle will, like an enemy in an airlock, shoot into the keg as pressures equalize. I use this technique for gelatin and SMB additions to the keg. However, it can be applied to dose anything liquid to a keg where O2 needs to be minimized. Sometimes the most genius of solutions are also the simplest. I think this is such a beautiful idea, Michael, one that I'd never considered.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that sounds... It sounds like a really good solution to me. It sounds kind of complicated for me. I don't have any of the equipment to do, like you're saying, to put it in there. But yeah, I mean, if you're really worried about the oxygen that's left in the keg after you've purged with the solution in the bottom, then yeah, I mean, I like the analogy there to the spaceship and ejecting your enemy out the airlock. But yeah, I mean, that seems like it would be a good idea. Like I said, whenever I use SMB, I don't really worry about it. I put the SMB solution in the bottom of the keg and then purge the keg. And so kind of doing what he's doing with the bottle, just without all the extra steps. I've never had any issues with it. I think Jake does something similar and he said he hasn't had any issues with it, but hey, yeah. I mean, if this works for you and it helps you keep oxygen out of there, awesome.
Yeah, sometimes written instructions are far more confusing, or they sound a lot more convoluted than when it really comes down to doing, what the things are instructing you to do. I actually think this is quite simple. It sounds like the only extra bit of gear required is a carbonation cap, which I admittedly don't have one. I've never been interested in carbonating in small PET bottles, but I guess what those things fit on like your normal soda bottle. So, everybody's got a little bit of extra beer line lying around. I think it seems pretty simple. But again, we said this, I believe, in our cold side oxidation episode. Unless you're pushing liquid out so that the CO2 is displacing that liquid with carbon dioxide, I don't know if there's a good way to know that just pumping CO2 in, purging the bottle, pumping more in, purging it again. There's probably still a decent amount of I don't know. Gas is mixed, but there's probably still a decent amount of oxygen in that bottle. So I don't know how helpful that would be, but I still like the idea. I think it's a pretty genius idea, particularly given the whole difference in pressures and equalization and all of that. So thank you for the idea, Michael. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Perhaps one of the most underrated styles, at least in my opinion, American Amber Ale is so good when it's done right. Well, listener Scott Mendez, who is also an active member of the Brew Club from New Bedford, Massachusetts, brewed one up that he calls 19 Diggity 2 Amber Ale, which he said took a number of iterations using various ingredients to settle on the recipe. 19 Diggity 2 uses Mecca Grade Estate malts, Maris Otter, chocolate malt, and some caramel malts. It's hopped with Cascade, Centennial, and Citra. Yum, yum, yum. And it's fermented, very interestingly, with Imperial yeast L17 Harvest, a traditional lager strain, but he ferments it at ale temperature. Sounds like a fun one to me. Now, just a heads up, if you're the type who's a little sensitive to certain language, there is a certain word used in this review that you may not like, so proceed with caution.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
I feel a little bit oppressed.
Drink the beer.
Do you value the talent?
Jersey.
Cheers to you.
I'm going to drink it. It has no smell.
I'm going to watch you.
It's good.
I love you, Timmy. Hey, cheers. All right, what is it? What is it, and what do you like about it?
Couldn't tell you what it is. It's kind of toasty tasting.
You can't hurt me in front of the entire world and stuff.
Kind of metallic-y at the end.
I don't know what to do. You're
Jersey. All right, mine's gone.
What is this?
I don't know what it is.
On the scale of delish to not, is it delish?
It's semi-delish.
Okay, Timmy loves it, which means it must be a sour.
It's not a sour.
Or a Coors Miller Lite.
It's none of the above. This has a little bitter and metallic.
It's an ESC.
Okay.
Now, how about this? Do you like it?
Yeah, it's not bad. I drank it already.
I love it. And here's to you.
All right.
Best of friends we may be, but if we ever disagree, Fuck you, and here's to me.
I'm going with 6.
On a scale of 1 to 17,000, I'll give it 15 jerseys.
15. That's pretty high.
Yeah, it was a good beer. That was a good beer.
I'll bump it up to 6.5.
I loved this beer. Scott, you're killing it, buddy. And thank you for brewing up an excellent version of American Amber Ale. I could have consumed many a bottle of 19 Diggity 2. Such a fantastic beer.
I love amber ales, especially whenever they're real done. It's absolutely one of my favorite styles. Probably my number 2 under Kolsch in terms of styles. Those amber ales are so good. So interesting using Harvest and fermenting it at ale temperatures. I could imagine, because Harvest has got a little bit of not an estery character, but it's got a pronounced character to it. I would wonder what that would do at ale temperature, and that really might accentuate those nice caramel notes in that amber. So sounds like the guys loved it. Tim drank it down real fast, and it got, I don't know what the scale of 17 or 15 over 17,000 jerseys is, but they sounded like that was a good scale. So
yeah. I've noticed this thing with the guys is when they drink beer, they don't know what the style is. I don't tell them anything about the beer they're drinking. So when they drink styles that on like when we're drinking on the side, not reviewing beers that they typically enjoy or they have certain opinions about, when it aligns with their review, even though they don't know what the style is, there's something, I guess, validating about that. And that's how Tim is as well. He likes amber ale. He's fine with it. Most of the time he thinks it's a little bit too hoppy. I felt like Scott's 19 Diggity 2 was, and I don't use this word often, it was a perfect balance of malt character, hop character, and just that clean fermentation. I read these descriptions usually while the guys are doing the review, as I'm reading the descriptions that the brewer sent in. I forgot. I must have skipped over it or something. I didn't realize that this was fermented with Imperial L17 Harvest until I was preparing for this episode. So drinking that beer, I would never have guessed. I would have guessed something like Flagship or the Chico strain. It was that clean, and it was just so well done. Please, people, if you brew American Amber Ale, I will just serve American Amber Ale to Jersey and Tim from here on out if you send it in. So we would really love for you guys to send us your American Amber Ale or anything else that you make. If you'd like to have Jersey and Tim review it, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. Thanks again, Scott. I loved your beer. Send me more, please. We'll be back to talk about replacing oxygenation with olive oil right after these brief messages. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Yeast requires oxygen to ferment beer, and while some rely only on simple aeration via shaking or vigorous racking to a fermenter from the kettle, others pump pure oxygen from a tank into their wort. Personally, I've never owned an oxygen tank and have had decent results with my less precise aeration methods. But when I heard folks talking about olive oil as being a potential replacement for oxygenation, I was both intrigued and I guess the most appropriate word would be skeptical. Cade, I know this idea isn't brand new. Let's speak a bit about when this idea even came about.
Yeah, so it actually came about before I even started brewing, I think. So the first scientific study that was done by New Belgium back in 2005 in connection with a graduate student or a person who was a graduate student at the time named Grady Hull. And they came up with this idea that maybe you could replace oxygenation, like actually adding pure oxygen to the wort with adding olive oil, which I think is scary, but fascinating if it works. I don't know how deep you want to or can get into this. What was the hypothesis that led to this idea that olive oil could replace, I don't understand what the magical piece of olive oil is that would make somebody go, oh, if we just toss that in, we won't need to add oxygen to the beer. Like, where did that even come from? Yeah, if you go back to what's the point of oxygenation? Like, why do we add oxygen? Why do we add oxygen to the wort? Then we can sort of answer the question about why would olive oil have anything to do with oxygen? I mean, at face value, you look at that and you go, okay, oxygen's a gas with O2, and olive oil is something different. I mean, I don't even know if it has oxygen as a component, but that seems very different, and why we would even think about using those two things for the same purpose. But we talk about oxygenation and adding oxygen a lot. And the reason why is because yeast cells are surrounded. They have cell membranes and cell walls. And to make those cell walls, they have to have two compounds, which are sterols and unsaturated fatty acids. Unsaturated fatty acids exist in olive oil. But before we go too far into that, let's back up. Okay, so we're asking about oxygen and why we need that in the first place. I just said it helps with cell wall and cell membrane. So what's the point there? Well, the point is the cell has to get things that are outside of its cell into the cell in order to metabolize it. Just like you eat food, right? You have to put it in your mouth, chew it up, get in your stomach, then your stomach digests it, right? So it's got to come from outside into the inside. Yeast don't have a mouth, they have a cell wall and a cell membrane. So that means things have to come through, like sugar, like nutrients, zinc, calcium, magnesium, manganese, all these other things, right. Water, oxygen. All of these things have to come in past the cell wall and the cell membrane. And if the cell membrane doesn't have sufficient oxygen, it can't make the lipids which form the cell membrane and cell wall. So things can't get in. It's like imagine if you forgot to build a gate in your cell in a wall, and then people are trying to get inside your compound or something, and there's no way to get in because there's just no way for things to get through there. Eventually, you're just going to die. So oxygen is what it's. Yeast can synthesize the sterols and unsaturated fatty acids that they can use to make lipids. So they can actually make those things themselves, but they need oxygen in order to complete those processes. Now, we're not going to go into the procedures because the actual procedures are, 10 or 12 consecutive reactions that have to happen. Yeah. So that's maybe subject for a more detailed podcast. But at the end of the day, we want oxygen in the fermentation so that the yeast can make their cell wall and their cell membrane and be able to take in sugars and nutrients. Taking in sugars and nutrients allows them to ferment, right? That allows the yeast to do its job of turning the sugars in the wort into alcohol, CO2, and making this beverage that we have, this beer. So you can imagine if we don't have oxygen or something that substitutes for the sterols and unsaturated fatty acids, those yeast aren't going to be able to do their job. They're just going to die. Sure. And you're not going to have an attenuated beer or any of these other issues. So that's kind of a general overview of oxygen, right? Of why we need it.
Now, so I say often that I've never used pure oxygen, and I mean that. I mean, there's a lot of things that I've tried a couple of times, and I don't notice a difference. I'm not going to do it anymore. I've never owned an oxygen tank. And the beers that I have brewed, I've never put a probe into the wort and pumped oxygen in. I bought one of those weird pond pump aeration stone setups like 15 years ago, used it twice, thought it was a pain in the ass, didn't notice a difference, so I gave it away, Now, is it that I guess what I'm trying to ask is I've never run into problems that I would associate with a lack of oxygenation. Now, I do aerate. I guess it's not terribly intentional, but when I rack to my fermenter, I'm doing it from my kettle, which is up on a shelf, and my fermenter's below, and I run some line, some tubing down in there, and I let it splash. And I've never had an issue that the typical issues, at least, that people claim can come from a lack of oxygenation. Is it possible? And this is what I've always told myself, that the yeast that I'm using, whether it's a very fresh imperial yeast pouch or some other yeast that I'm propping up in a starter, does that take care of could it be that is what the reason is that I'm not having big issues in my beers, is because I'm not making super high gravity beers, but two, I'm preparing those yeast, or those yeast when they're hitting the wort are already healthy enough to go and ferment. Because this is one of those things when I started brewing back in 2003, when you're doing extract, oxygenation is the last thing on your mind. There's just shake your carboy, but as you start to get into it and you start trying to get closer and closer to commercial tasting beer, something that you might could find on the store shelves, people start talking about, one of the things you got to start doing is oxygenating your wort. It's a cheap solution. If somebody's not having that issue, I guess I'm asking this for my own validation, Cade. Is it because the yeast is healthy? I mean, would that, I guess, supplant also the need to oxygenate manually?
Oh yeah, I mean, so much to unpack there in that. But yeah, my answer first to your question is yes. It is possible that the yeast has sufficient oxygen in it, and that there's sufficient oxygen in your wort that you're doing just having it exposed to the air and mixing it in the from your boil kettle into the fermenter. So yes, for a first generation pitch, you could have sufficient oxygen in your fermenter. Where it gets sort of interesting is doing second or third generation pitches, because at that point you've gone through a quote anaerobic, meaning without oxygen, fermentation, right? So the yeast have taken up oxygen and they've used it to make sterols and unfatty acids and things. So if you're repitching, or if you're harvesting yeast and then storing it, there may not be sufficient oxygen in that storage vessel or in the repitch whenever you add it.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say too is you don't need a lot of oxygen. We're talking 8 to 10 parts per million of pure O2 is kind of what the recommended range is. Now, I've never actually measured the oxygen that I've gotten into my fermenter, but I've read a bunch of stuff online and at other places, and people say that from shaking the carboy and shaking, the fermenter, or really just vigorously transferring your wort over into a fermenter at a homebrew scale, you're going to get somewhere between 4, 5, 6 parts per million.
Right.
So that difference probably isn't enough to make a substantial difference, especially if you're doing a fresh pitch of yeast.
Well, and also I would think on the homebrew scale, on a 5-gallon batch, the physical pressures on that yeast, right? And I guess I'm using pressures as a double entendre here. You're not putting as much stress on the yeast because it's got less wort to ferment. Though I guess relative to batch size, you could argue that it's about the same, but still, you literally have less pressure on it because those fermenters aren't as big, right?
Yeah.
You don't have that pressure pushing down on the yeast.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to say that too. There's a big difference in the commercial fermentation vessel versus a home brewing vessel,
Right.
and that's the pressure and the amount of liquid that's going into that tank. When you're transferring from the boil kettle on a commercial scale, you're doing some sort of inline oxygenation,
right,
going into the fermenter. For example, we do that at Blue Owl. We also we also vigorously pump the wort into the fermenter so that hopefully whatever is in the fermenter is getting nice and mixed up. And we're really concerned about oxygen because we're already in a hostile environment where yeast because we're brewing sour beers. So yeast need the nutrients that aren't necessarily, they may need more O2 or something like that because they're in such a difficult environment.
Right.
So
right.
yeah, I mean, almost every commercial brewery that I have toured. Now, obviously, I have not been to every commercial brewery in the in the U.S., but I've been to quite a few, and I've read enough, and I've talked to enough brewers that I know that this is a standard practice. I mean, this is what almost every commercial brewer is doing, adding that O2 in line. And there are reasons for that. The pressure and like I said, a lot of brewers are harvesting yeast, and they need to make sure that their yeast have sufficient oxygen whenever they're getting harvested.
Definitely.
And being stored. They have a bunch of other concerns that they need to do that are different from the homebrew scale. Now, I mean, obviously, this isn't an episode on, what happens if you oxygenate or don't oxygenate the beer, but you can look back at some of our past experiments, and it does seem like, at least on a homebrew scale, and according to Brewlosophy's results, that oxygenation may not have much of an issue on that homebrew scale, especially in fresh pitch yeasts. Now, on the fresh pitch side, I will say that's not necessarily a panacea, right?
Yeah.
Because the fresh pitch yeast cell is not going to have a huge amount of oxygen in there. It may have enough oxygen to get started so that those first cells can start to reproduce, and you may not need as much oxygen in the fermenter, but you do still need oxygen.
Right.
And so shaking your fermenter, shaking the carboy, vigorously transferring, like I transfer from a pump. So I just crank that chugger pump wide open and send it out of the boil kettle over into the fermenter. It splashes and it foams, and I'll shake it even whenever I do it, just to make sure I get enough oxygen into the wort.
Now, just to clarify, for my own, because I'm dumb, I'm this whole olive oil thing kind of shook me up.
You
here.
are not dumb, Marshall.
Well, thank you, Cade. It's not you made a comment where you said you still need oxygen. Now, I think in traditional thinking, yes, you need oxygen because of how the yeast reacts to that oxygen. But it's not, when we're thinking of this in the context of EVOO, as Rachel Ray used to call it, it's not that you need oxygen. It's that those cells need to have the nutrients that allow them to build up those cell walls, right? That they need to be strong so that they can let that sugar and such in, so that they can metabolize it to make beer effectively without producing off flavors and such. So kind of shifting back to the discussion about olive oil, when I'm thinking about oxygenation in terms of olive oil and olive oil, God, it's so weird that we're talking about this, but olive oil replacing oxygen, it's not that it's replacing oxygen, it's that it's doing the same, I guess it's having the same result, but without the use of oxygen, just going through a different pathway, I guess.
That's exactly right. Different pathway. So the yeast can synthesize lipids. It's all about making lipids for the cell wall and cell membrane. Well, not all about, but that's the primary point.
Right.
So you got to make these lipids. The yeast can do it, but to do it, they've got to consume oxygen. So what if you just gave them the unsaturated fatty acid that they need in order to synthesize lipids? Then they wouldn't have to consume that oxygen, right? They wouldn't need that extra oxygen. They could consume oxygens for fermentation, right? It's also needed for fermentation. That's part of the pathway there. So they could use oxygen for other purposes. And here's a big one. What about residual oxygen that's not used by the yeast? Okay, that stuff can actually cause staling actions later on in packaging, or if packaging has been sitting for a while, that oxygen that's inside the solution could create staling. So these are both ideas for why olive oil could be used as a substitute for oxygen. You don't have to worry about staling, and you don't have to have as much oxygen. You don't have to worry about an oxygen stone for commercial breweries. Think about like adding oxygen to the beer, all of the equipment that requires. You could get rid of that. For a home brewer, you don't have to have an oxygen stone or a pump or anything. So this could be a really useful thing, right?
It sure sounds like it. I mean, again, theoretically speaking, I could see how, especially, when Grady Hull was a graduate student, he's going, well, geez, if the real purpose of oxygenating is to, increase whatever sterols and cell wall development or whatever of the yeast, why not just give them to them in a simpler form? And olive oil, I could see that being like this epiphanous moment, thinking that olive oil might work. But he had to, at the very least, have considered some of the concerns I think a lot of brewers think about when they first heard about or are hearing about using oxygen in place of or using olive oil in place of oxygen, which for me, the biggest one is even if it's not going to impact flavor, oil and water don't mix. We know that. So maybe it falls out. I would still think it'd have something like a negative effect on foam development, perhaps some impact on mouthfeel.
Yeah. Or what about like olive oil sticking to the hoses and the fermenters?
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah.
Or that olive oil aroma, coming through if it gets in the foam or something like that, and now you've got that spicy olive oil, smell. What if that stuff stays in there? That could be really gross. Or what if I pour my beer out and there's this like layer of oil on top of my beer in the glass? That's kind of gross and disgusting, right?
Yeah, it sounds disgusting. Well, you know where it would work really well is on an Acetobacter infected beer, right? Because then you just got vinegar and oil. You dip some bread in or something.
Acetobacter with olive oil in an oyster stout.
Oh,
there we
God.
Go. Now we've solved everything.
Oh my word. Well, what that does is it brings us to the question of how much olive oil do you actually use, though? Because when right off the bat, you hear about this whole idea and you're like, that just sounds hokey and whatever, and in my mind, I'm thinking they're pouring a whole thing of Napoleon olive oil into a batch of beer. But really, my understanding is that you're not using very much olive oil at all.
Yeah, no. Well, I guess this is a good point also to start talking about the study. We've been sort of towing around the New Belgium study that Grady performed, but the amount that they came to in that study was 1 milligram per 25 billion cells. That's a milligram, not a milliliter of olive oil. So it's not a very big amount. It's actually a very small amount, and that's per 25 billion cells. So a normal standard pitch of being 100 billion, 200 billion cells in a homebrew pack, you're only going to need 4 or 8 milligrams of olive oil.
Yeah.
That's a teeny tiny amount of olive oil. But the study, the reason why I sort of preface that by saying in the study, that's what they used that was closest to the oxygenated control beer. So when they ran it through all of the metrics to see what fermentation time, ester production, fusel alcohols, tasting, sensory, all that sort of stuff, the one that was closest was 1 milligram for 25 billion cells. That also happened to be the highest dosage rate that they used.
Oh, go
in
figure.
The study.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So that was interesting. They didn't add more than that. And there's reasons why if you read through the study. So 1 milligram per 25 billion cells was what was in the study. But again, that being sort of the highest number that they tested.
Yeah.
Now, it was really cool in this study what they did. If you don't mind, we'll go through it a little bit.
Yeah, please.
But the study actually, they did 4 trials. The first 2 I'm going to call are like tester trials because they wanted to see, okay, does this actually add a flavor difference to beer? So they did 2 smaller batches that they ran through sensory, added olive oil to one, and then just did controlled oxygen to the other one. Oxygen at New Belgium's standard oxygenation practice. So they added a small amount of olive oil. They didn't notice a difference in the beers in the first 2 studies. And then they said, okay, well, we didn't notice any flavor differences. We are seeing sort of a higher ester production from the olive oil one, but it's still within ranges. So let's ramp it up and do a full production batch. I think they did a 2,100 hectoliter batch. So that's a full size batch for New Belgium. So props to New Belgium also for doing this study where you're putting olive oil in an entire full batch of beer. But it was really cool. So they did that. They ran it through their sensory profile, and fascinatingly, the fermentation time with the olive oil batch was 94 hours. The fermentation time with the oxygenated batch was 83 hours. So those are pretty close together. I mean, that was just like 9 hours difference for those 2. The esters and everything were very similar. Everything was within standard deviation. And one of the coolest things that I saw was they ran this through their like senior level tasting panel. So it was 12 to 14 people on their senior that are trained, that get tested weekly on their sensory abilities and different ester profiles and all that. They passed it. They tested it 3 different times. They tested it out of the fermenter, in packaging, and then in the quality control lab. And all 3 times they passed it and couldn't tell the difference between the one that had olive oil in it or the one that had oxygen added to it. Which
the implications there are that, or what we can extrapolate from that particular finding, right, is that olive oil didn't have a noticeable impact over a properly oxygenated batch of beer, right?
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing was, here's the quote from the paper. It said the beers produced from these fermentations were comparable in flavor and foam retention to beers produced by traditional wort aeration. So not only were the flavors the same, but also the foam retention was the same.
Yeah.
Which I think is really cool. So, okay, we've got some evidence here now that this oxygen thing does work. This olive oil thing does work. It has maybe the same impact as aeration. But here's the cool part. The overall effect on oxidation in the final product was improved when the tests were compared to the controls after 3 weeks warm storage.
That's interesting.
So the olive oil beers actually had less oxidation effects than the traditionally aerated wort whenever they were stored at 3 weeks warm temperature. So I think that was fascinating. So
That's
it said,
awesome.
okay, yeah, we can make this beer taste the same using olive oil and reduce staling after 3 weeks of warm storage.
So do we know how they measured that the rate of staling or whatever? Because was it sensory, or what? Did they run it through some form of a some sort of a metric?
Yeah, both. So they did gas chromatography on it, and so ran it actually to see what different esters and stuff were in it. I mean, just looking at the graph, because I've got it in my notes. If anybody wants it, just email me, Cade@brewlosophy.com, and I'll send you the paper. But acetaldehyde, DMS, ethyl acetate, isobutanol, isoamyl acetate, isoamyl alcohol, and ethyl hexanoate. So they tested all of those things, and all of the esters in both of the olive oil and control test were within New Belgium's range of standard deviation for for beer. So they did that. That was actual analytical data, and then they also ran it through their senior sensory panel, doing a trying it at 3 times, coming out of the fermenter, coming in at packaging, and in the quality lab. So and they rated all different kinds of flavor and aroma characteristics: sweet, sour, malty, bitter. Does it have DMS? What's the body like? Is there bitterness? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, they ran it through a full suite of tests.
That's awesome. And like you, I think that the most fascinating aspect of it is the rate of staling being reduced in the olive oil batch. That alone is something that would make me reconsider using olive oil, because that's the worst thing, right? Cold side oxidation. We talk about it all the time. Now, I understand that the New Belgium study opened up doors for a lot of people to start messing around with this idea and questioning whether it would actually work. In 2012, White Labs did another study, right, where they did an olive oil dosed beer versus an aerated a batch beer.
Yeah, they did. But real quick, before we move on to the White Lab study, I wanted to talk about, there was one thing in the study. So this study was adding olive oil during storage. So they would normally, whenever they harvest their yeast at New Belgium, they'd go and put it over into a storage tank, and then they would aerate the wort during storage. So they didn't add olive oil to the fermenter. They added it to the stored yeast.
Gotcha.
That was in there. So that's kind of an important distinction. I think you can extrapolate from that, hey, maybe you can add it to the fermenter, which is the impetus for why I did my experiment.
Right.
But this was kind of an important thing. The reason why is because White Labs also did the same thing. So White Labs also did a study. They tried to essentially recreate the results that Northern Brewer did. They did it on a much smaller scale. So they did it on 5-gallon batches instead of the 2,100 hectoliter batches that the New Belgium study was done. But yeah, they had very similar results. The finished beers were very similar. There's not, from what I could tell, White Labs didn't publish, at least where I could access it, the actual, gas chromatography results and sensory panel results. But my understanding is they went through full lab tests and full sensory tests as well at White Labs. So got all the same thing, and they found sort of exactly what New Belgium did, or at least reproduced those same results.
That's awesome. Again, an eye-opening thing. They come back 7 years later and are like, well, okay, let's put this thing to the test using our lab equipment. And they find the same thing. I mean, it does seem, around 2012 is when I remember talk of using olive oil in place of oxygenation kind of popping back up and people kind of getting more and more interested in it. And I wonder if it wasn't because now we've got not only Grady Hull's, New Belgium original 2005 experiment results, but we've got the White Labs, who's highly trusted, in the brewing world. They're coming out and saying they found the same thing. I mean, it seems convincing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got two full studies with full suites of tests that were done. I want to look back. If anybody has that White Labs study, I'm sure it's been published somewhere. I just wasn't able to find it at things that I have access to. But if anybody has that, please send it to me, because I'd be really interested to see what tests White Labs actually ran on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you've got these two labs saying, hey, when we added it to yeast that was being stored, those yeast performed very well, or the same as yeast that got aeration. So this is, again, why I was thinking, hey, maybe this would be a really cool idea if we did an experiment on this to see if we could add olive oil to a fermenter and maybe substitute oxygenation. So
absolutely. And as someone who doesn't use pure oxygen and has no experience with adding olive oil to my wort, I was definitely interested in the results of your experiment as well, Cade, and that is exactly what we're going to be chatting about when we return from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Well, it's been proposed that olive oil can be used as a replacement for oxygen, as we just discussed. You were curious to see for yourself, Cade, and recently put it to the test.
Yeah, like I said, I was super excited to see if what contribution olive oil would have going into a beer. So I decided to do a 10-gallon batch of Kolsch, so nice, crisp, light lager. Well, maybe not a lager, depending on how you define
lager-ish,
it.
yeah.
Lager-ish, yeah. Simple grist, so 94% Pilsner malt, 6% wheat malt. That's kind of a standard Kolsch grist for me. Mashed it at 147 F or 64 C for 60 minutes. Boiled it for 60 minutes. Added Magnum, 20 grams of Magnum at 60 minutes, and then 14 grams of Technang at 5 minutes. So very standard, very light hop additions. Good Kolsch recipe. That's actually one of my favorite Kolsch recipes. So
mine looks very similar. Yeah.
Yeah. After boiling, I chilled the worts down, took refractometer readings to get an OG of 1.044, which is perfect. Evenly split that wort between two SS brew buckets and allowed them to chill the rest of the way overnight. Now, this is where I introduced the variable. So here is where I added 8 milliliters of extra virgin olive oil to one batch and then left the other one alone. I did not add oxygen to the other one.
So if I can cut in here real quick, that to me is made me even more interested in the results of this particular experiment, because as we discussed earlier, the original New Belgium study and the 2012 White Lab study both compared olive oil dosed batches to oxygenated wort. In this one, just to be very clear, you didn't touch the other wort. You left it alone. No oxygenation whatsoever. So if there is going to be a sensory difference, a perceptible difference, we're probably, arguably, more likely to find that between these two beers, even though this is a homebrew scale experiment. In my mind, we're more likely to see that come out in this one because you're not comparing like with sort of like, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we scheduled it, or why we not scheduled it, why we organized the experiment this way. We wanted to test what it would be like not oxygenating versus adding the olive oil and providing sort of easy access to those unsaturated fatty acids.
Right.
Also added way more olive oil than we needed. 8 mLs of olive oil was a lot, and it was way more than needed. But it was the amount that we decided on just to make sure we got a good quantity of olive oil in there, and we would, naturally emphasize the variable to the extent that olive oil was going to add any flavors or aromas or any problems or anything like that. Yeah. So yeah, I added that. Now I added those 8 mLs of olive oil about, it was probably about 8 hours before I pitched the yeast. In both of we didn't talk about this in the previous segment, but in both of the studies, the New Belgium Grady Hull one and the White Lab ones, they added the olive oil 5 hours before. That's just so that it gets emulsified into the solution and, has the ability to sort of mix in and disperse.
Do its thing, right?
Yeah, do its thing. So then I pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast's G03 Dieter into each batch. Dieter. Is that better?
Good.
And then I fermented it at 54F or 12C starting there. So this was interesting because I noticed that the beer with olive oil showed signs of fermentation activity earlier than the batch with no oil added, which was fascinating.
Yeah, this makes me think of my experience with using yeast nutrient, which we just recently talked about in the last episode you and I were on together, Cade, about using zinc. In my experience, I had never had issues, flavor or aroma or character issues with my beers that weren't brewed using certain techniques like yeast nutrient. Now, I talked about how in that last episode, how I really only use yeast nutrient for my ciders, but I did notice as good as my cider without nutrient has always been, I noticed a huge decrease in the lag phase when I use nutrient. And it sounds like maybe that's what was happening with yours as well. And again, we can't speak yet. You're still observing just fermentation. We don't know if there's a flavor difference, but maybe that additional oil, it would seem, because that's the only difference between these two batches at this point, did have some sort of a positive impact on the yeast. At least that's what I'm getting from this.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the two prior studies showed that olive oil, when compared with a beer that had oxygen added as a control, they fermented sort of similarly, right? Which is great. That means that maybe the olive oil is actually doing something. This, to me, also supports that hypothesis because we've got one that didn't have oxygen added. We had one with olive oil, and that one with olive oil fermented or started fermenting faster than the one that didn't have it. So that also to me says, hey, maybe this actually will work to help the beers move along and at least ferment faster. So those beers sat for 7 days at 54, and then they got raised to 54F 12C, and then they got raised to 68F 20C. And left alone for another 4 days. Now, during this time, the olive oil beer actually finished fermenting 2 days earlier than the one that didn't have olive oil, that didn't have any additions to it. They both hit the same FG, which was 1.033. But I also thought that was really fascinating, too, that the one with olive oil finished 2 days earlier.
Yeah, also, it was 10:03, not 10:33, you weirdo. But
sorry.
10:33 was only 11 points lower than your starting gravity. But that the fact that it finished earlier, it started earlier, it finished earlier, all of this these are good signs. And I talk about this a lot, that a lot of what brewers do is to avoid potential problems, right? At this point, I'm sitting here going, because we're getting updates as you're brewing these beers and you're telling us, hey, check this out. This is kind of cool. I'm thinking, damn, I mean, if these beers, you kind of hope the beers, if they taste different, that the one with olive oil tastes better. But if they don't taste different, at the very least, you can say, well, I mean, I could finish beer earlier if I use a little bit of olive oil in place of nothing at all, of course, right? Because we've already got the evidence saying olive oil is about the same as oxygenation. But in this case, I mean, it seemed promising, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. And whatever the result was going to be at this point, I'm thinking, dang, wow, olive oil actually sped up fermentation. It got it finished 2 days faster. Or if this actually turns out to be either significant, like you said, and they like olive oil, that's the preferred beer, or non-significant, and they can't tell the difference between these, you've come up with a meaningful solution to maybe those of us that don't want to buy the equipment for oxygenation stones or something. Yeah. So of course, not having the results at this time and just pontificating, but that's a really cool application for this. So we wanted to get tasters involved, so we got to go through the rest of the process first, which I do my normal process: cold crash down to 34F or 1 degree Celsius. Left the beers overnight before pressure transferring them to CO2 purge kegs. Burst carbonated them in my Keyser, and then allowed them to condition for another week before serving to participants. So
now, before you serve them to participants, you had a go at trying to distinguish them in your own unblind triangle tests that you served yourself in as blind a fashion as possible. Before you even did that, though, was there any differences that I mean, obviously, I think people are going to be interested in whether there was foam degradation in the olive oil beer that was any worse than in the non-olive oil beer. Was there any differences in the way these beers looked?
There was no difference that I could tell. I mean, the beers looked the same. The foam character was the same. If you look at the picture on the website, the one that's the olive oil glass looks like the foam dropped a little bit more, but that's just because it was poured first. Yeah. And it's a Kolsch. I mean, Kolsch doesn't have crazy good foam retention, but, I didn't notice any different in the foam. That was consistent with the New Belgium and White Lab study. They didn't see differences in foam retention, and I also didn't either. So, they looked the same.
They do. They look identical to my eyes as well. I mean, I'm looking at them now, and the foam looks the same. One's going to be lower. That's just pouring practices. But other than that, I mean, they look identical. So that, again, more contributions to this in the pot of positive over here. How did you do on your triangle tests?
I did terrible on my triangle test, although maybe not as bad as I've done in other ones, but 2 out of 5 is what I got right.
You just guessing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that was totally guessing. I mean, the beers tasted the same, and of course, like I say, once I've done my 2 out of 5, or done my however many attempts I'm gonna do for that session, I always go back and say, okay, I know I added olive oil to this, so let me now look for olive oil in this beer, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't find anything. Yeah, there was no olive oil spiciness, there was no oil slickness or mouthfeel differences or anything that I could taste.
So from your anecdotal experience alone, which is a lot of what we see in brewing experimentation online, which is great, but alone, your anecdotal experience is telling us, I put olive oil in beer way more than is required, but we overdid this one. I got quicker fermentation. I got a quicker finish in these beers in that particular batch, and I couldn't tell them apart, which just says, again, we've done some experiments on oxygenation that don't show a perceptible difference. We've got a couple that do, but in this scenario, to me, it just says, at the very least, adding a little bit of, or a lot in this case, of olive oil to wort before pitching your yeast can, again, expedite the fermentation process, which I think is fascinating. Of course, you had to serve these to actual blind tasters, though.
Yeah, of course. So I did this at a Zealots Homebrew Club meeting, like I do most of my tastings. Got 21 participants. At 21 participants, that would mean we needed 11 in order to achieve significance. But we actually had 5. So 24% of the tasters were able to tell the beer with olive oil from the one without, and it was not significant. So people were not reliably able to tell these beers apart.
Let's dig into this a little bit, because for so many of these experiment results that we talk about, that we publish, it's easy for people to say, oh, that means it doesn't matter, which we never, ever contend. If you're one of those people, watch out. We'll call you out. A significant result does not a principle make. I say that often. Either does a significant result, right? We need retesting and retesting. But this one is particularly interesting to me because, again, you've got an observable effect. You've got the same observable effect that people doing bigger studies have seen, have found. This is arguably an effective way to ensure yeast health without having any negative impact on the characters, on beer character. And I just think that's fascinating. This is one of those non-significant results that just feels sort of significant to me.
Yeah, of course. This one it's really interesting, right? I mean, we've the 2 prior studies and this all like you just said, the olive oil didn't change the character. In this one, I had observable results where I saw the beer go faster. I mean, again, this is one experiment, but this coupled with the 2 prior experiments, seem to say that, hey, maybe adding olive oil actually could increase increase the yeast's access to unsaturated fatty acids, right, and improve fermentation.
Yeah, dude.
Now, grain of salt on all these things too, right? We have done experiments that say that there's no difference between a beer that has oxygen and one that doesn't, right? So we could just be in that same realm. We didn't even need the olive oil in this experiment, right? It could have just been there was sufficient oxygen already in the wort, and that's why we didn't taste a difference. You can say that, but still, we added a lot of olive oil, and that olive oil didn't change the character.
Right.
So, I think you've still at least got that result, even if even if you want to throw these results out, because oxygenation or adding oxygen to wort may or may not matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. But everything always with a grain of salt. But these results were really really interesting.
Yeah.
To me.
So I have a question before we move on to some reader comments. If somebody is, again, I view oxygenation and I guess olive oilination as something that you do to avoid potential off flavors, right? Or to avoid the potential of an issue with fermentation. That's how I view it. So if somebody is risk averse and maybe doesn't want to invest in an oxygenation system, but would be open to using something like olive oil just to reduce that risk, how much would they typically use in a 5-gallon batch, which I believe that's like 19 liters, rather than the 8 milliliters? Is there a recommendation for how much somebody might use based on the 2005 New Belgium experience?
I don't have it on me, but it's a very small amount. It's not very much. Like I said, it would be between 4 to 8 milligrams, per 100 billion or 200 billion cells. So milligrams again, not milliliters. So like a really small amount. I'd be guessing right now, but if somebody wants to email me, I can send them the calculation and figure it out.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's more a function of the amount of yeast you're pitching, which makes sense because it is a thing for yeast, as opposed to beer volume or OG. But again, the amount of yeast you pitch is also correlated, for most people at least, with the strength of the wort that they're pitching it into as well. So just something to pay attention to. I did hear somebody one time, I forget where this came from. Somebody said, basically, if you dip a toothpick in olive oil and then like stir that around in your wort, that has been nullified. I don't believe that is true at all. It's actually more than that. It's a measurable amount that you can add to the wort. I don't know exactly what it is either. And, just seeing as I've never used pure oxygen, and I'm not sure, and I'm not having issues with what I would say is a lack of oxygenation. I don't know if I'm going to start adding olive oil to my beer when I'm, prior to pitching the yeast, but it's not something I'm totally against. I don't even know if it would come to mind during most of my brew days to do that, but it does seem like a really neat way to, at the very least, improve or potentially improve your yeast health. And I love the thought of maybe adding a drop of olive oil to a starter of yeast that you've harvested multiple times and may be lacking in that particular, the sterols and such because of oxygen depletion. So very, very cool stuff.
Yeah, totally. I agree with all of that. I'd love to see it even in a big or like a high OG beer, where oxygenation is going to matter a little bit more.
Yeah. And I'd be, little insider info here for those of you who listen this far into the show. Cade and I have actually been talking about starting a spin-off podcast that would be hosted by Cade, where he digs into, individual experiments that have been done in labs, at various different universities and such. And I would love to get Grady Hull on if we, when that show ends up coming out. Let us know if you want to hear that, by the way. I'd be interested in your guys' thoughts. But getting Grady on or getting the folks from White Labs on to talk about that experiment and kind of go a little bit deeper into the idea behind using olive oil in place of oxygenation. Because to me, it's a really interesting that like olive oil, that's something that would never come to mind for, I think, most people, but it did for them. And it does seem to show, or it does seem to have some sort of an impact. Very, very fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
So we do have some reader comments. We're going to get to those right now. The first one comes from, I don't know how to say this last name, Chris, either Conrads. He says it would be interesting to see the difference in how these two beers compare over time in holding up against oxidation and preserving their character. I am interested in this as well. I don't think you did this, Cade, but especially after what you said was one of the results of one of those past experiments, I believe it was the New Belgium one, about having an extended shelf life, not oxidizing as much on the shelf. This would be fascinating.
Yeah. So I actually drank these Kolsch's a little too fast to do any real tests about staling. I think I had a party at my house a couple of weeks afterwards, and so we killed those kegs within a month, and I didn't do any tasting of it. But that is something that I would love to see, is how does this stand up? How does the olive oil beer stand up after 2 months or 3 months or 4 months longer?
Yeah.
How does it stand up to that? Does this actually reduce on a homebrew scale oxidation issues? I think that would be fascinating.
Well, and you start to think about things like compiling, I guess good post or cold side procedures. So purging a keg, maybe using SMB, if that's what floats your boat, packaging in a closed transfer, pressurized transfers, and then having that little bit of olive oil in there to reduce. I mean, if you put all of those together, perhaps that's the magical, mix that's going to preserve that beer for the longest that it can be preserved. Very, very interesting idea. I'd like to see another experiment on that as well, Chris. Next comment comes from Keith Gorski. He says, I read somewhere that using olive oil can affect head retention. We've talked about this. From your images, it seems like the olive oil batch has less foam. In your opinion, did the addition of olive oil have any effect on head retention? You did address this a bit, Cade. Maybe you want to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we addressed this a little bit earlier. The images were just the timing of the pour. That was all. That was the only difference there. There was no significant foam retention issues that I could see. After I got this comment, and I wish I had taken photos of it, but after I saw this comment, I went back and poured and did some sort of like home lacing tests. So like pour a glass, then either drink a couple of sips or pour a little bit down the drain and see if the lacing sticks down the side of the glass, because if oil was involved, like if you stick your finger in a beer and there's oils on your finger, that head is going to drop real quick and there won't be lacing and stuff on the glass. Right. Same reason why if you don't rinse your glass with detergents, there's or if you don't get the detergent off, there won't be foam sticking down the glass. So I actually did that test, and both of them had lacing going all the way down the glass. The collar followed the beer all the way down. So no issues as far as I could tell with foam retention. Yeah.
I mean, and again, keep in mind, this was 8 milliliters of olive oil, which is an order of, I think somebody had said like 8 to 10 times the amount that's recommended, potentially even more. And even that amount didn't affect the foam. I think that part of it is not, it's okay, good. So a smaller amount is even less likely to have an impact on that piece of it. So I think that's promising as well. All right, final comment comes from somebody who calls themselves Mad Dog. He says, I've been using a single drop of olive oil in my yeast propagation starters for some time. Based on the prior published data, I've felt this adds sterols for the yeast so they can be their best, and yet I don't have to worry about O2 issues in the propagators. Don't have any objective data, but sure do seem to have happy starters. Standard starter for me is a 2-liter batch with 200 grams of light DME and a pinch of yeast nutrient, a drop of olive oil, and a drop or two of anti-foam. Boil for 6 to 7 minutes, and then I chill. I store it in fridge until I need to prop another round of yeast. Now, just a quick note before we discuss this one, because I think I do like the idea also of using olive oil in the starter, because that's where your yeast is developing a lot of those sterols, right? But he says I felt it adds sterols. Science don't care about your feelings, buddy. I think it does. You are by adding
or unsaturated fatty acids.
Right.
I admit it. Admittedly, I'm not. I'm still a fledgling chemist, so I'm not sure that sterols, are added by olive oil. I do know that unsaturated fatty acids are added, and that's also a component for lipids, which are used to build cell walls and cell membranes. Right. But like you said, the science don't care. So you are adding at least unsaturated fatty acids into the yeast. But yeah, the rest of it I think is great. Adding it into a starter is exactly what the New Belgium and the White Lab study were, essentially, right? They're adding it into their tank that they're storing the yeast and using that to make sure that the yeast can stay. And then when they're propagating it up to pitch into their fermenters, they're using that olive oil and oxygen to do their aeration, I guess we'll say.
Yeah, and Mad Dog, sounds like you're having positive results, so that's great, right?
Yeah, dude. I'd love to hear that somebody else is using olive oil and it's working for them.
I just had a thought as well. We love imperial yeast, obviously. And a lot of us, this is a weird admission, but I can't remember the last time I made a starter, because, imperial yeast is usually so fresh and they have such a high cell count. But I'm wondering what if their secret sauce is olive oil? What if they're adding that? And that's what they're doing different to make their yeast so awesome. Who knows? But that does bring us to the end of this episode. I think we've covered quite a bit on at least the method of swapping olive oil for oxygen, or oxygen for olive oil, as it were. Is there anything else you want to say before we hit the road, Cade?
Oh yeah, I'd love to see more data on this. You know, it's such a fascinating one. I'd love to see some people repeat it. If you've got experiences, send them to me. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'd like to hear from people about this proposed idea for another show. We're being serious.
Yeah.
Cade and I have been talking about this a bunch. I know, Cade, you're excited about possibly doing what we are tentatively calling the Brew Lab, where we talk with actual scientists, you know, who do this lab work. So anyways, let us know what you think about that. And don't forget, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link of the article of that experiment on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.